The year was 1887, and the quiet of the high plains was a palpable entity. For 14-year-old Arthur McBride, it was the sole constant companion he had remaining. It had settled into the log cabin the very day his father's rasping cough had finally ceased, and it had deepened into something immutable when his mother succumbed a winter later, claimed by a sorrow that had hollowed her from within. Now, the silence was his legacy, as substantial as the parchment granting him ownership of the 160 acres of unyielding land that encircled him on all sides. His existence had contracted to the scope of his daily tasks, hewing wood, inspecting his traps, tending the sparse vegetable patch, and gazing out at a horizon that offered only more of the same. Arthur was diminutive for his age, lean and resilient, possessing the toughness of creatures that have learned to yield rather than fracture. His countenance was a perpetual study in solemnity, his blue eyes holding a vigilance that suggested a far greater age. He seldom spoke, having no one with whom to converse, and the sound of his own voice frequently startled him when he offered hushed words to the recalcitrant mule or muttered curses at a rusted hinge. The world had imparted to him that survival was a subdued, solitary endeavor. Emotions were a luxury, an encumbrance one could ill afford when every iota of strength was requisite merely to witness the next dawn. His sorrow for his parents was a stone he carried in his gut, cold and weighty, a burden he never acknowledged but was perpetually burdened by. He existed in a state of controlled desperation, his routines a bulwark against the vast, overwhelming solitude of his life. He prepared his meager sustenance, mended his threadbare attire, and pored over the same 3 volumes his mother had treasured: a Bible, a compilation of verses, and a well-worn primer, until the printed words became more familiar than his own reflection. The homestead was an isolated point in an ocean of grass. The nearest settlement, Harmony Creek, lay a 2-day journey by horseback, and he had no inclination to venture there. The townsfolk were aware of his circumstances. They regarded him as an unfortunate postscript, the orphaned boy clinging to a lost cause. Their commiseration felt more piercing than their disdain, so he remained distant, embracing the isolation that had been imposed upon him. He was a specter lingering at the fringes of his own existence, a youth preserved in the amber of his profound loss. One evening, as the sky began to deepen into the rich violets and oranges of dusk, a tempest gathered from the west. It arrived without harbinger, a formidable expanse of cloud that engulfed the distant peaks and swept across the plains. The wind escalated to a sustained wail, a resonant lament that seemed to assault the very core of the cabin. Arthur had just concluded securing the mule in its sheltered lean-to, and was making his way back to the entrance when he perceived a faint, prostrate form near the creek bed, almost swallowed by the whipping tall grass and encroaching twilight. Prudence was an ingrained instinct, instilled by his father. Out here, the unforeseen was rarely benevolent. It could signify a predator, or worse, a human with malevolent intentions. He flattened himself behind a rocky protrusion, his heart a frantic percussion against his ribs, and peered through the rain-streaked atmosphere. It was not an animal, it was a person, small and motionless. He observed for a considerable interval, the rain clinging to his hair, his thoughts a cascade of grim possibilities. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and he discerned the dark plaits, the buckskin attire, the unmistakable profile. It was an indigenous woman. Every cautionary tale he had ever absorbed in Harmony Creek surged back to him. Accounts of skirmishes, of bitter land disputes, of a people who had ample reason to harbor animosity towards settlers such as himself. His father had been distinct. He had spoken of the Cheyenne with deference, engaging in fair trade with them and advocating for a peace that few others seemed to desire. But his father was no longer present. To offer assistance was to invite a cascade of complications he was ill-equipped to manage. To abandon her was to permit the storm and whatever had incapacitated her to complete their grim work. He observed her stir, a faint, feeble movement, a hand clutching her side. He could discern the dark discoloration spreading across her garments even from his vantage point. The stone of sorrow within him seemed to shift. He recalled his mother, her body growing colder in her bed while he had watched, powerless. He had been a mere boy then, incapable. He remained a boy now, but this was a different circumstance. This presented a choice. The wind howled like a creature in mourning, and within its lament, Arthur made his decision. He pushed himself to his feet and ran, not towards the sanctuary of his cabin, but towards the fallen stranger. She was younger than he had initially judged, perhaps only a few years his senior. Her face, possessing an angular beauty, was pallid beneath its coppery hue, her lips tinged with blue. Her leg was contorted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly fractured, and a deep, ragged laceration on her flank was bleeding sluggishly. Her eyes fluttered open as he knelt beside her, dark and filled with a mixture of pain and fierce, defiant distrust. She recoiled as he reached for her, a low guttural sound of warning escaping her throat. "I mean you no harm," Arthur stated, his voice rough and unaccustomed. The words felt alien on his tongue. "You will perish out here." He was uncertain if she grasped his spoken words, but she surely understood the desperation in his tone. He was awkward and uncoordinated, yet surprisingly robust from his years of manual labor. He draped her arm over his shoulders, his own slender frame straining under her weight, and half-dragged, half-carried her through the lashing rain towards the faint lamplight of his dwelling. The door sealed shut behind them, enclosing them within, two solitary souls from adversarial worlds, bound together by a tempest and the stark, primal reality of an injury. Inside, the warmth emanating from the small hearth offered a striking contrast to the tempest raging beyond. He gently settled her onto the cot that had once belonged to his mother, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly. Her gaze followed his every motion, sharp and appraising, even through the haze of her suffering. He noticed her eyes briefly scan the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the axe beside the woodpile, the latch on the door. He understood that he was perceived as a potential captor, an adversary. He deliberately turned his back to her, an act of trust he could ill afford, yet offered nonetheless. He fed the fire, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He filled a basin with water from the rain barrel and presented it to her, accompanied by clean strips of fabric torn from one of his mother's aged linen sheets. He knelt beside the cot, placed the basin on the floor, and looked at her, a silent inquiry conveyed. For a prolonged moment, she simply stared, her breathing shallow. Then, with a barely discernible nod, she granted her acquiescence. His hands, rough and calloused, nevertheless moved with a surprising gentleness as he attended to her. His knowledge of medical care was limited to what he had gleaned from tending to livestock, but he understood that a clean wound possessed a greater chance of recovery than a soiled one. He meticulously trimmed away the blood-soaked buckskin surrounding her side, revealing a severe laceration in her flesh, likely inflicted by the horn of a startled buffalo or an elk. He cleansed it to the best of his ability, his brow furrowed in concentration. She endured the pain with a stoicism that put him to shame, her only indication of agony being a tightening of her jaw and the clenching of her fists within the thin blanket. He could do nothing for her fractured leg, save to immobilize it with splints fashioned from floorboards. His work was clumsy but earnest. Upon completion, he covered her with his thickest wool blanket and withdrew to a stool near the fire, leaving her to the solitary experience of her discomfort. For hours, the sole audible elements were the crackling of the fire, the incessant drumming of rain upon the roof, and her soft, pained exhalations. He did not sleep. He watched over her, a self-appointed guardian amidst the heart of the storm. He observed the tension gradually recede from her form as exhaustion claimed her. He noted the stern line of her mouth soften slightly in her restless slumber. He was unaware of her name or her history, but within the confined lamplit space of the cabin, she was no longer an abstract menace or a political icon. She was simply a person, injured and vulnerable, and he was the sole barrier between her and oblivion. A peculiar sense of purpose began to fill the vacant spaces within him, a feeling so unfamiliar he scarcely recognized it. It felt akin to warmth. It was well past midnight when a new sound joined the symphony of the storm. It commenced as a low, mournful cry from a distance, but it was answered by another, and then a third, closer this time. Arthur's blood ran cold. He knew that sound intimately, better than his own name. Wolves. The tempest must have driven them down from the higher elevations, and the scent of blood emanating from the woman's wound acted as a beacon across the prairie. The woman, whose name he would later ascertain as Vavina, stirred on the cot, her eyes wide with a renewed terror that overshadowed her pain. She uttered a single word in her own tongue, a word that required no translation. Arthur moved with haste, his own fear a cold clench in his stomach. He tested the bolt on the door, sliding it firmly into place. He shoved the heavy trestle table against it for added security. He surveyed the single window, its shutterboards aged and weathered. It represented the vulnerable point. The howling intensified, encircling the cabin. It was not the sound of a solitary animal or two, but a pack. They were ravenous and audacious. He could hear the scraping of their claws against the log walls, the snuffling and whining as they probed the foundation for any fissure, any weakness. He grasped the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its tip still faintly aglow. It was an inadequate weapon, but it was the only implement within his reach that he could effectively wield within the cabin's confines. The rifle was too slow to reload, futile against multiple rapidly moving targets. A sudden violent impact struck the window. A substantial weight slammed against the shutter, causing the wood to groan in protest. Then, a snout, black and moist, forced its way through a gap, teeth snapping at the air. Arthur lunged, thrusting the poker into the opening. The wolf yelped in pain and rage, recoiling with the scent of scorched fur, but the assault had only just begun. Another wolf hurled itself against the door, its immense weight causing the robust timber to tremble. They were an unyielding force, a shadowy flood of raw hunger and primal instinct. Arthur moved with the desperate agility of a trapped creature himself, darting from the doorway to the window, his thoughts a frantic whirlwind. He urgently needed to secure the shutter. The stack of firewood was his sole source for materials. Taking a deep, bracing breath, he unbarred the door, intending a swift excursion to retrieve supplies and return within mere seconds. It was an ill-conceived, desperate gambit. The instant the door creaked open, a blur of gray shot forth from the enveloping darkness. Arthur possessed no capacity for contemplation, only immediate reaction. He raised his left arm instinctively to guard his throat, and an agonizing, incandescent white-hot sensation erupted from his forearm as fangs plunged deep into the muscle. He cried out, a sound laced with shock and intense suffering, and unleashed a powerful kick with all his might, connecting solidly with the wolf's ribcage. The creature released its grip, and he scrambled back inside, slamming the door shut and firmly ramming the bar into place, his injured arm screaming in protest. He slumped against the door, gasping for air, the warm, sticky flow of his own blood coursing down his arm and pattering onto the floorboards. That marked his initial wound. Vivina pushed herself up onto one elbow, her gaze locked onto him, her expression a bewildering blend of terror and profound admiration. Despite the gnawing pain, Arthur felt a steely resolve solidify within him. They would not breach the cabin. They would not reach her. The wolves grew increasingly agitated, emboldened by the metallic tang of his blood. They commenced tearing at the chinking between the logs near the cabin's foundation. Arthur seized a kettle brimming with scalding water from the hearth and poured it through the gaps, eliciting a cacophony of pained yelps in response. It offered a fleeting respite. While he was occupied, a wolf managed to pry a plank loose from the bottom of the door. A paw, then a head, began to force its way through. Arthur stomped down on it with his boot, but the wolf lunged, its teeth snagging the thick leather and tearing through to the flesh of his calf. He cried out again, kicking himself free. This second bite incurred. He grabbed a log from the woodpile and began hammering the dislodged board back into its position, his leg throbbing with pain. As he worked, a sharp splinter from the splintered wood embedded itself deeply into the palm of his other hand, a third injury amidst the chaos of the struggle. The night dissolved into a muddled sequence of agony, dread, and desperate ingenuity. He wedged his father's old tool chest against the window shutter for added reinforcement. He utilized his dwindling supply of nails to re-secure loose boards. The pack displayed remarkable intelligence and coordination, methodically testing every inch of the cabin, their shadowy forms flickering past the gaps, their panting breaths an ever-present menacing sound. A peculiar detachment began to settle over him, his fear supplanted by a cold, almost animalistic focus. He was no longer Arthur McBride, the solitary orphan. He had become a guardian, a bulwark of flesh and bone, and he refused to falter. Hours crawled by agonizingly as the storm began to abate, yet the siege persisted. Exhaustion weighed heavily upon his shoulders, a crushing burden, and the torment from his wounds was a relentless, gnawing fire. He had to remain upright, had to continue moving, He embarked on a perilous dash to the lean-to to retrieve the axe. A wild charge into the encroaching darkness. A wolf sprang from the shadows, its jaws clamping down on his thigh. The fourth bite. He swung the heavy axe in a wide arc, and the wolf recoiled, but not before its teeth had gouged a deep furrow in his leg. He stumbled back into the cabin, now bleeding from 4 distinct wounds, his clothing torn and saturated with a mixture of rain and his own blood. He could feel his strength rapidly ebbing. His movements became sluggish. His vision periodically narrowed to a single, piercing point. The alpha of the pack, a massive dark beast exceeding the size of the others, seemed to sense his declining state. With a terrifying surge of power, it hurled its full weight against the weakened window. The tool chest shifted, the shutter splintered, and the wolf, a terrifying spectacle of fur and teeth, tumbled into the cabin. Time appeared to decelerate. Vavina shrieked, a raw, piercing sound of utter terror. The wolf initially disregarded Arthur, its luminous yellow eyes fixed on the helpless woman huddled on the cot. That was its critical miscalculation. A primal fury, born of protectiveness and sheer desperation, coursed through Arthur, overriding his pain and exhaustion. With a guttural roar of his own, he launched himself at the formidable wolf, wielding the axe. The beast turned upon him, a dizzying blur of motion. It was swifter, more powerful. It evaded his clumsy swing and lunged, its jaws closing around his shoulder, shaking him like a child's plaything. The pain was blinding, an entire universe of agony, the fifth bite. He felt the bone groan under the strain, but he did not relinquish his grip on the axe. He drove his knee upwards forcefully into the wolf's abdomen, and as it recoiled, he swung again. This time, the axe bit deeply into the animal's flank. The wolf howled, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, and spun, snapping at him once more. Its teeth grazed his side, tearing through his shirt and skin. The sixth bite. They became a whirlwind of violence within the confined space of the cabin, overturning the stool, scattering glowing embers from the hearth. Arthur was functioning solely on sheer willpower. He felt his legs about to give way. He knew he was fading. He had to bring an end to this. He managed to regain his footing, planting himself resolutely between the wolf and Vavina. The alpha gathered its formidable strength for a final, lethal lunge. Arthur held the axe ready, his knuckles turning white with the effort. As the wolf sprang, he swung not at its head, but at its front legs. A woodsman's technique for felling timber. The axe connected with a sickening crack of bone. The wolf collapsed, its forelimbs broken, but its momentum carried it forward. In its final agonizing throes, it lunged one last time, its jaws finding his already ravaged thigh and clamping down with all its remaining power. The seventh bite. A raw, broken scream was ripped from Arthur's throat. The pain was absolute, a blinding white light that consumed everything. The wolf went limp, its lifeblood pooling on the floorboards beside his own. The cabin fell into a profound silence, punctuated only by his own ragged gasps. He stood swaying for a moment, the heavy axe slipping from his numb fingers. He looked at Vavina, saw her wide, tear-filled eyes, and then the world tilted precariously and dissolved into a welcoming darkness. He collapsed onto the floor, a broken dam of a boy who had held back the flood and been swept away in the process. The first hint of dawn appeared as a pale, watery light filtering through the grime and shattered wood of the window. It illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The carcass of the enormous wolf lay cooling on the floor. The cabin was in disarray, its sparse furnishings overturned, the floorboards slick with blood. On the cot, Vavina was alive, weak but conscious. On the floor, barely breathing, lay Arthur. He was a ravaged shell of a boy, his clothes shredded, his body a canvas of brutal wounds. The bleeding had largely subsided, but his skin was a ghastly white, his breath shallow, almost imperceptible tremors. Vina had spent the preceding hours drifting in and out of consciousness, her own pain a distant muted throb compared to the overwhelming symphony of violence she had witnessed. She had observed the small, quiet boy transform into a creature of unimaginable ferocity. She had seen him absorb wound after wound, refusing to succumb, his body acting as a living shield between her and the predatory pack. Now, in the quiet aftermath, a profound, aching gratitude filled her. So potent it was almost a physical sensation. She attempted to move, to crawl towards him, but her fractured leg and her own debilitating weakness kept her pinned to the cot. All she could do was watch him, her tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, and offer silent prayers to the spirits of her people that he would not perish. It was at that moment she heard the distinct sound of approaching horses. Her heart leaped with a simultaneous surge of hope and apprehension. Hope that it was her people, and fear for what they would witness, what their judgment would be. A contingent of Cheyenne warriors, led by her father, the war chief Voken, crested the gentle rise overlooking the cabin. They had been tracking her since she had failed to return from her solo excursion the previous day. Their search had grown increasingly desperate as the storm had descended. They spotted the cabin, an unfamiliar structure on their ancestral lands, and their expressions hardened. They observed the signs of the wolf pack, the tracks, the blood staining the mud, and their countenances grew grim. They dismounted, moving with the silent, fluid grace of men born to this land. Voken raised a hand, and his warriors fanned out, their weapons at the ready. They advanced towards the cabin as if it were a hostile fortification. The door hung ajar. Voken pushed it open and stepped inside, his gaze sweeping across the entire scene. In a single comprehensive glance, he saw his daughter alive, relief warring with fury on his stoic features. Then his eyes fell upon the deceased alpha wolf, its size and power evident even in death. He took in the state of the cabin, the unmistakable evidence of a desperate, protracted struggle. Finally, his gaze settled upon the small, motionless form of the white boy on the floor. His eyes narrowed. The most immediate and obvious conclusion, though the most unpleasant, was that the boy had harmed his daughter, and the wolves had been drawn to the ensuing conflict. But Vavina cried out, her voice weak but clear. "Father," she said, her words spoken in the Cheyenne tongue, "no, he saved me." Voken's head snapped towards her. His warriors crowded the doorway behind him, murmuring in confusion. The tribe's most senior tracker, a man named Hanya Haka, stepped past his chief and knelt, not beside the boy, but near the scene itself. His wise, aged eyes deciphered the narrative written in blood and chaos. He gestured towards the bite marks on Arthur's arms, his legs, his shoulder. He indicated the protective positioning of the boy's body between the cot and the dead wolf. He pointed to the bloodied axe resting near Arthur's hand. He spoke in a low, reverent tone. "The boy did not fight the wolves to preserve his own life," Hanya Haka declared, his voice resonating with unwavering certainty. "He fought them to protect her. He sustained not one, but multiple bites. He maintained his position throughout the entire night. This child possesses the spirit of a badger, one that will confront a mountain lion to safeguard its den." Voken looked from the tracker to his daughter, and then back to the boy. He approached and knelt, the joints in his knees popping with a quietness that contrasted sharply with his formidable reputation. He gently cleared the blood-soaked strands of hair from Arthur's brow. He perceived the extreme youth in him, the pallor of near death etched upon his features. He noted the 7 distinct and severe injuries. Each one served as a testament to an act of bravery so immense it transcended the divisions that separated their people. This was not an adversary. This was a fighter in the most genuine sense of the term. A profound stillness descended upon the dwelling, a silence far more significant and meaningful than the isolated quiet Arthur had endured for such an extended period. It was a silence born of esteem, of profound admiration. Voken's gaze met his daughter's, and within her eyes, he recognized the absolute truth of the scout's account. He had arrived expecting to find his daughter missing, or to exact retribution. Instead, he had discovered something miraculous. He turned to his warriors and conveyed a sequence of hushed, resolute directives. 2 of the men quickly constructed a makeshift litter, using blankets and spear shafts for Vina. Voken himself gathered Arthur into his embrace. The young lad was remarkably light, like a collection of slender branches, embodying immense valor. He held him with the utmost care, as he would his own son, his touch a silent acknowledgement of his initial distrust, a solemn pledge for a debt that rightfully needed to be repaid. They carried the injured pair from the damaged hut and into the crisp clarity of the morning. The entirety of the tribe, who had been observing from a distance, witnessed their leader emerge, bearing not his daughter, but a young boy of the plains, gravely wounded. A ripple of bewilderment spread amongst them, but it was swiftly subdued by Voken's commanding presence. They carefully placed Vina upon a travois, and her mother hurried to her daughter's side, tears of profound relief streaming down her face. Vulcan then mounted his own steed, gently securing Arthur's lifeless form before him, cradling the boy close to his chest. Arthur McBride, the neglected orphan of the vast open lands, was no longer solely defined by that solitude. He had become a responsibility of the Cheyenne, a child who had sacrificed blood to safeguard one of their own, and who would now be vigilantly protected by every member of their community. As the group commenced their gradual, cautious procession back to their settlement, Arthur began to stir, his eyelids flickering for a brief instant. His unfocused gaze met Vulcan's. He discerned no animosity, no wrath. He perceived only a deep, potent sense of thankfulness, and a respect that resonated more powerfully than any sense of belonging he had ever experienced. Subsequently, his eyes closed once more, and he drifted back into the restorative embrace of unconsciousness, being conveyed away from the quietude of his past and towards the harmonious sound of a future he could never have possibly envisioned.